A listener name. Have you ever, opened up a textbook and it feels like it's written in a completely different language?
Yeah,
Like trying to make a five-course meal with just a butter knife? You
absolutely.
know what I mean?
Yeah,
That's why today's deep dive is all about adapting teaching materials, taking those blah resources and turning them into something that really sings,
right.
especially in the world of English language teaching.
And what's really interesting from my perspective is that even subtle changes in how we present information can completely change how well someone actually learns.
Yeah.
It's not always about reinventing the wheel, but how we're presenting it.
Right. So less like a complete kitchen makeover and more like just finding the right spice rack to make everything pop.
Yeah, yeah, I like that.
So you've shared some notes on adapting materials for ELT, and one thing that really jumps out is this idea that one size fits all just doesn't work in the classroom.
Right.
Like imagine teaching a room full of students with all different learning styles and levels. How can one textbook possibly cover all of that?
Yeah, it can't. And that's where this whole concept of materials adaptation comes in. It's about taking those existing resources, so those textbooks, those articles, whatever it is that you're working with, and tailoring them to that specific group of students that you have in front of you. This excerpt from class notes, The Art of Materials Adaptation in ELT, really kind of digs into this.
Okay, so less force-feeding information and more like creating a customized tasting menu for each student's brain. I think I can get behind that.
Absolutely. It's about making that information digestible and relevant and maybe even a little delicious.
Now, you mentioned in your notes this teacher, Zainab, who's just starting out and she's really struggling to create engaging materials. But then she stumbles upon this idea of layout, like the actual visual organization of the information in the competency framework for language learning materials. And it seems so simple.
Yeah.
Was that a light bulb moment for her or what?
Oh, absolutely. Layout is one of those things that often gets overlooked,
Yeah.
but it can really make or break a learner's entire experience. Think about it. Headings, bullet points, images, they all act as those signposts to help guide the learner through the material.
So it's not just what you're teaching, but how you're presenting it on the page that makes a difference.
Precisely. In Zainab's case, her materials were kind of like a maze for her students to navigate. Headings were unclear. There were big blocks of text, and it was just really overwhelming for them to look at. By studying how other materials use layout effectively, things like color coding different sections or using icons to highlight key information, she was able to transform her lessons.
That's a great example. I know for me, even if something looks too cluttered or disorganized, I just tune out completely.
Right. And that's exactly what we want to try to avoid, especially when we're talking about learning something new.
So we've talked about the importance of tailoring materials to different learning styles and making sure our layouts are not scaring anyone off.
Yeah.
But there's more to it than that, right? What about this whole idea of cognitive load that you mentioned?
Yes, cognitive load. This is a big one. Essentially, cognitive load refers to the mental effort that's required to process new information.
Okay.
And when there's too much cognitive load, our brains basically just hit the overload button.
Okay. I'm getting flashbacks to cramming for exams in college.
Sure.
Definitely overloaded my brain a time or two.
We've all been there. But imagine that on top of trying to learn a new language, that's what it's like for our students if they're facing materials that aren't really designed with their needs in mind.
Yeah. Talk about a recipe for overwhelm. I'm guessing that's where this whole adapting materials for cognitive load comes in.
Exactly. It's about being mindful of how much mental effort are we asking our students to do at any given time. And there are a lot of practical things that we can do to lighten that load in our materials, just like Zainab found with layout.
Okay, so give me an example. What does that actually look like?
Sure. So let's say you have a really dense reading passage, packed with new vocabulary, complex grammar. And instead of just kind of throwing your students into the deep end with that,
Right.
we can adapt that material to make it a little bit more approachable.
Okay, how do you do that though without losing the point of the material?
Right. So one thing you can do is pre-teach some of that key vocabulary. So instead of students encountering those words for the first time within this long, complicated text, they've already had a chance to kind of grasp what those words mean in isolation.
Yeah, so it's like giving them the building blocks before you ask them to build a house.
Exactly. Another thing you could do is break down those long, complicated sentences into shorter, more manageable chunks.
Okay.
And that not only reduces the cognitive load, but it also just makes it easier to understand. And remember, we were talking about visuals earlier.
Yeah.
Visuals can be so powerful for this too.
Yeah, it's funny you say that because I never really thought about it in terms of teaching materials and stuff. But even for me, just like in my own life, if I see a diagram or a picture next to something, it clicks so much faster in my brain.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And it's especially true for those visual learners out there.
Yeah.
And then another thing to keep in mind is just the power of white space.
What do you mean?
So those areas on the page that don't have any text or images.
Oh, you mean like giving your eyes a break?
Exactly. White space is actually really important for visual processing.
Mm-hmm.
And it can make a big difference in how overwhelming a page feels.
Nobody wants to open something and just see a wall of text.
Exactly.
Yeah.
We want it to be inviting.
So it's like that balance between having enough information that it's interesting and challenging,
Right.
but not so much that it's just completely overwhelming.
Exactly.
It's like walking a tightrope, but with a textbook.
It is. It's about creating those materials that are challenging enough to really help our students grow.
Right.
But not so challenging that it discourages them from learning. And that's a really important point. It's not about dumbing things down. It's about making them smarter, making them more accessible.
Yeah, and meeting students where they're at and giving them what they need to actually learn and succeed. So we've covered a lot of ground here today. We talked about adapting for learning styles, the power of layout, and of course, making sure that we're not completely overloading our students' brains with information. So listener name, as someone who's really thinking about this stuff in your own teaching, what are some of the biggest takeaways that are sticking with you?
Well, you really hit on all the key points there. But if I had to boil it all down to one thing, it would be this. Don't be afraid to experiment. There's no right or wrong answer when it comes to adapting materials. What works for one group of students or one teacher might not work for another.
That makes sense. Everyone's different. Every classroom's different.
Exactly. But by keeping those key principles in mind, layout, cognitive load, really understanding the needs of your students, you can take your materials from something that's kind of like, to something that's really exciting and engaging.
I love that. From boring textbook to exciting learning experience. It's like the difference between handing someone a bag of flour and sugar and eggs and giving them a piece of cake.
Yeah, I think I know which one I'd rather have.
Me too. And that actually kind of sparks a final thought for you, listener name. What if instead of thinking of teaching materials as these like static textbooks, we thought of them more like interactive apps? Always changing and adapting. How could that change the way that we think about learning in the classroom? Something to think about. Thanks for joining us for another deep dive. We'll catch you next time.